A single dad stood up for a woman at a coffee shop. He had no idea she was a billionaire. What made a single dad step into someone else's problem without hesitation? And how could one ordinary moment at a coffee shop connect to a billionaire he never knew existed? Hello, everyone, and welcome. We're so glad you're here for another heartfelt story inspired by kindness, courage, and unexpected turns. If you enjoy meaningful stories that stay with you long after they end, please subscribe to the channel and turn on notifications so you never miss a new episode. Thank you for spending your time with us and for supporting this community with every view, comment, and share. Before we begin, tell us in the comments, what would you do if you witnessed someone being treated unfairly in public? Now let's step into the story together. Aren't you ashamed of yourself? The words cut through the quiet hum of the coffee shop so sharply that every conversation stopped in the middle of a sentence. A ceramic cup settled onto its saucer with a soft click. Someone slowly lowered a newspaper. Even the barista froze behind the espresso machine. Ethan Brooks looked up from the corner table where he had been answering a work email while waiting for his black coffee. Near the pickup counter, a well-dressed man stood with his jaw tight and his voice raised at a woman wearing a simple navy sweater and faded jeans. She held her paper cup with both hands, saying nothing. Her expression remained calm, almost unreadable, but the faint tightening around her eyes suggested she had heard every cutting word. "People like you always expect someone else to fix your problems," the man continued. "Maybe if you dressed like you belonged here, people would take you seriously." A few uncomfortable glances drifted across the room before disappearing just as quickly. Nobody wanted to get involved. Nobody except Ethan. He pushed back his chair without rushing. The scrape of its wooden legs against the floor echoed louder than it should have. He walked toward them with the steady pace of a man who had learned long ago that staying calm often carried more weight than raising his voice. "That's enough," Ethan said. His tone was quiet, but it landed harder than a shout. The man turned, surprised that anyone had interrupted him. His eyes swept over Ethan's worn work boots, faded work jacket, and calloused hands before a dismissive smile crept across his face. "This doesn't concern you." Ethan held his gaze without blinking. "It does when someone is being treated with disrespect." For a long second, neither man spoke. The woman finally looked at Ethan, curiosity replacing the guarded distance in her eyes. She didn't ask him to help. She didn't tell him to stop. She simply watched, as if trying to understand why a complete stranger would risk becoming the next target. The man let out a short laugh. "You're really going to play the hero?" Ethan shrugged lightly. "No, I'm just asking you to leave her alone." Silence settled over the shop again. It wasn't the awkward silence from moments earlier. It felt heavier, as though everyone was waiting to see which kind of person would speak next. The man shook his head with a scoff, muttered something under his breath, grabbed his coffee, and walked toward the door. As it closed behind him, the tension slowly dissolved into the hiss of steaming milk and the quiet clatter of cups. Ethan turned to leave, believing the moment was over. "Thank you," the woman said softly. He offered a small smile. "You don't owe me anything. Nobody deserves to be embarrassed in public." She studied him for another heartbeat, almost as though she wanted to ask another question, but instead she simply nodded. Ethan returned to his table, picked up his untouched coffee, and checked the time. He still had an afternoon service call across town before picking up his daughter from school. To him, it had been nothing more than an ordinary choice. But as the woman quietly watched him walk away, she slipped her phone into her pocket after reading a message that made her thoughtful instead of surprised. She looked once more toward the door Ethan had just walked through and whispered almost to herself, "Maybe he's exactly who I've been hoping to find." Ethan never heard those words, and he certainly had no reason to imagine that before the week was over, the quiet woman from that coffee shop would change the direction of his life forever. Ethan's pickup truck rumbled through the late afternoon traffic as golden sunlight stretched across the streets of Cedar Ridge. He rolled down the window, letting the warm breeze replace the stale air inside the cab. His phone buzzed through the truck speakers. "Dad, do not forget today is family reading night," Lily said, her cheerful voice filling the cab. Ethan smiled without taking his eyes off the road. "I would not miss it for the world. Promise. I promise." She laughed softly. "Miss Carter said parents have to read with funny voices. That sounds dangerous. You are going to embarrass yourself." "Probably." Her laughter lingered even after the call ended, And for the first time that day, the weight on Ethan's shoulders felt lighter. He pulled into the parking lot of a small office building where his final heating and cooling service call waited. It was not glamorous work, but it paid the bills, kept food on the table, and gave Lily a stable home. As he tightened a loose vent inside the building, the property manager handed him an envelope containing his payment. "Thanks for coming out so quickly," she said. Ethan nodded. "Happy to help." On the way back to his truck, he noticed an elderly man struggling to lift a folded walker into the trunk of a sedan. Without thinking twice, Ethan set down his toolbox. "May I give you a hand?" The man looked relieved. "I would appreciate that." It took less than 30 seconds. "Thank you, son," the man said. Ethan simply smiled. Drive safely. He never asked for recognition. He never waited for praise. Helping people had become as natural as breathing, not because life had always been kind to him, but because it had not. Years earlier, after losing his wife to a sudden illness, he had promised himself that bitterness would never become the lesson his daughter inherited. Instead, he taught Lily something different every morning before school. Treat people with respect, especially when nobody else does. That evening, Ethan arrived at the elementary school just as parents filled the library. Lily ran toward him with a book clutched against her chest. "You made it. I told you I would." During story time, Ethan gave every character a different voice until the children burst into laughter. Lily covered her face, pretending to be embarrassed, but the grin she could not hide told another story. Across the room, another parent quietly watched the exchange before returning to her own child. Ethan never noticed. After the event, father and daughter walked toward the parking lot beneath a sky painted with shades of orange and purple. "Dad," Lily asked as they reached the truck. "Yes. Do you think good people always get something good back?" Ethan rested one hand on the roof of the truck before answering. "Not always. Sometimes doing the right thing is the reward. Everything else is just a bonus." Lily thought about that for a moment before climbing inside. Miles away, in a downtown office overlooking the city, the woman from the coffee shop paused as she studied a report resting on her desk. A small photograph paperclipped to the corner showed Ethan helping the elderly man with the walker only hours earlier. She traced one finger along the edge of the picture before quietly closing the folder. "One moment can be luck," she whispered. "Twice is a pattern." Then she reached for her phone and gave a calm instruction that would quietly place Ethan in her path once again before the week came to an end. The following Thursday morning began like every other workday for Ethan Brooks. He loaded fresh air filters into the back of his truck, checked his schedule, and took a final sip of coffee before starting the engine. His first appointment had been canceled overnight, leaving an unexpected hour free. Instead of heading straight across town, he stopped at a neighborhood grocery store to pick up ingredients for Lily's favorite homemade chili. As he walked through the parking lot carrying 2 paper bags, he noticed a shopping cart drifting slowly across the pavement toward a parked sedan. Without thinking, he caught it before it scraped the driver's side door. "Thank you," an older woman called as she hurried over. "That wind almost got away from me." Ethan smiled and handed her the cart. "It happens. Faster than people expect." She laughed. "Young man, kindness is becoming rare." Ethan shrugged. "I think people are still kind. Sometimes they are just in a hurry." The woman smiled thoughtfully before walking away. Across the parking lot, inside a dark gray SUV, Claire Whitmore lowered the pair of sunglasses she had been wearing. She had watched the entire exchange without saying a word. Her executive assistant, Melissa Grant, glanced up from a tablet filled with appointments. "You could have met him already," Melissa said quietly. Claire kept her eyes on Ethan as he carefully loaded the grocery bags into his truck. "Not yet. You have canceled 2 meetings this week just to observe him." Claire gave a faint smile. People can be generous when they think someone important is watching. Melissa raised an eyebrow. "And him?" Claire watched Ethan return the loose shopping cart to the collection area, even though nobody had asked him to. "He behaves exactly the same when nobody notices." Melissa closed the tablet. "That is why you are interested." Claire did not answer immediately. Instead, she remembered the coffee shop. The calm voice. The steady eye contact. No attempt to impress her. No request for her phone number. No curiosity about who she was. Just quiet dignity. It had become surprisingly difficult to find. Later that afternoon, Ethan arrived at another service call inside a small nonprofit community center where the air conditioning had stopped working during a youth tutoring program. Children sat at folding tables finishing homework while volunteers tried to keep everyone comfortable with portable fans. Ethan climbed onto a ladder, replaced a worn capacitor, and restarted the system. Cool air flowed through the vents a few minutes later, and relieved applause echoed through the hallway. The director reached for her checkbook. Ethan looked around at the donated furniture and shelves filled with second-hand books before gently shaking his head. "Use that money for the kids." "Are you sure?" she asked. "Absolutely." She thanked him twice before he quietly packed his tools and headed for the exit. What Ethan never noticed was the security camera above the front desk recording the entire interaction. Less than an hour later, Claire watched the footage on a monitor inside her office. She leaned back in silence while Melissa stood beside her. "He refused payment again," Melissa observed. Claire nodded slowly. "Not because someone was watching. Because that is who he is." She reached for a slim folder resting on her desk. Ethan Brooks, HVAC technician, widower, father of one daughter. Excellent work history. No lawsuits. No unpaid debts. Outstanding community references. Claire closed the folder without another word. Then she picked up her phone and made a single call. "Move tomorrow's executive meeting," she said calmly. "I have another appointment first." After ending the call, she looked through the office window toward the city skyline, unaware that Ethan was driving home believing it had been nothing more than another ordinary day. By the time the sun rose again, their next meeting would no longer be left to chance. Friday morning arrived with clear skies and a cool breeze that carried the scent of fresh rain across Cedar Ridge. Ethan finished replacing an aging thermostat at a family-owned bakery before checking the next address on his tablet. The work order listed only a downtown office building with a note requesting an inspection of an unreliable climate control system. It looked routine. He gathered his toolbox, climbed into his truck, and headed toward the city without giving the address another thought. Meanwhile, Claire Whitmore stood beside the tall windows of a quiet conference room, watching employees cross the plaza below. Melissa stepped inside carrying a folder. "Everything is ready," she said. Claire nodded without turning around. "Has he accepted the service request?" "He is already on his way." Melissa hesitated. "May I ask one question?" Claire smiled faintly. "You are going to ask it anyway. Why not simply introduce yourself?" Claire looked down at the people entering the building. "Because I already know what people become after they recognize my name. I still want to know who he is before that happens." Less than 30 minutes later, Ethan parked outside the glass tower. He glanced up at the polished steel entrance, adjusted the strap on his toolbox, and walked inside. The lobby was elegant but welcoming, filled with natural light and quiet conversations. A receptionist greeted him with a friendly smile. "Good morning. You must be here for the climate inspection." Ethan nodded. "That is right." She handed him a visitor badge. "Someone will take you upstairs." Moments later, the elevator doors opened onto an executive floor unlike any Ethan had serviced before. Original artwork lined the walls, and floor-to-ceiling windows overlooked the city skyline. A facilities manager greeted him and led him toward a mechanical room connected to a large conference suite. "The temperature keeps changing during meetings," the manager explained. Ethan removed a ceiling panel and immediately noticed a damaged sensor. "I think I found the problem." While he worked, voices drifted from the nearby hallway. Ethan ignored them, focused on tightening connections and testing airflow. The repaired system responded perfectly within minutes. As he packed his tools, he heard familiar footsteps approaching. He turned and found Claire standing a few feet away. She wore the same calm expression he remembered from the coffee shop, though today she was dressed in a tailored cream blazer instead of a simple sweater. For a brief moment, both of them smiled with genuine surprise. "I did not expect to see you again," Ethan said. "Neither did I," Claire replied, though the quiet confidence in her voice suggested something more. "It looks like you fixed another problem." Ethan glanced toward the mechanical room. "Fortunately, this one was easier than the last one." Claire laughed softly. It was the first completely unguarded smile Ethan had seen from her. "May I buy you a cup of coffee after you finish?" she asked. Ethan checked the time on his watch and hesitated. "I have to pick up my daughter this afternoon, but I have a few minutes. Then I would like to thank you properly." Before Ethan could answer, several sharply dressed executives appeared at the end of the hallway. The instant they noticed Claire, every conversation stopped. One by one, they straightened their posture. and quietly waited for her to speak. Ethan followed their eyes, confused by the sudden change in the room. Claire noticed his expression but said nothing. Instead, she offered him one more calm smile before turning toward the waiting executives. The first man stepped forward, lowered his head respectfully, and took a slow breath before addressing her with words that made Ethan's heartbeat suddenly quicken. The executive stopped a respectful distance from Claire and spoke with quiet confidence. "Good morning, Ms. Whitmore. The board is ready whenever you are." The hallway became perfectly still. Ethan blinked once, certain he had misunderstood what he had just heard. Claire met his eyes before slowly turning back to the executives. "Please give me 5 minutes," she said. "Of course, Ms. Whitmore." Every executive nodded before stepping back without another word. As they disappeared into the conference room, Ethan remained standing beside his toolbox, searching Claire's face for an explanation. She let out a soft breath and offered an apologetic smile. "I suppose I owe you the truth." Ethan laughed quietly, more surprised than upset. "I think that is a fair statement." Claire motioned toward a small seating area overlooking the city. "Would you still have those few minutes for coffee?" Ethan glanced at his watch, then nodded. "Yes, I think I do." A member of the staff brought 2 fresh cups without being asked. Ethan noticed the effortless efficiency, but said nothing. Claire wrapped both hands around her cup, staring out the window for a moment before speaking. "The day we met at the coffee shop, I was not pretending to be someone else. I simply was not introducing myself." Ethan smiled faintly. "That explains why everyone around here knows exactly who you are." She looked back at him. "I am the Chief Executive Officer of Whitmore Hospitality." Ethan leaned back in his chair, absorbing the words in silence. Images from the past week flashed through his mind. The expensive office, the respectful employees, the confidence she carried without trying to impress anyone. Suddenly, every small detail fit together. Claire noticed the realization settle across his face. "You are unusually calm." Ethan chuckled. "I repair heating systems for a living. I have learned not to panic until I know the whole problem." That answer drew another genuine laugh from Claire. It felt lighter than any conversation they had shared before. "Does it bother you?" she asked. Ethan considered the question carefully. "No. It surprised me. But it does not change who you were when we met." Claire lowered her eyes for a brief second. "Most people treat me differently after they learn my name." "Should they?" Ethan asked. She looked at him again, unable to answer immediately. The silence between them felt comfortable rather than awkward. Finally, Claire smiled. "That might be the first honest question anyone has asked me this week." Ethan lifted his coffee. "You were still the woman someone spoke to disrespectfully." "That is the person I remember." Claire's fingers tightened slightly around her cup before relaxing again. She had spent years wondering whether kindness toward her belonged to her or to the company she led. Sitting across from Ethan, she realized he had answered that question before he even knew it existed. Melissa quietly approached from the hallway, but stopped when she saw them talking. Claire noticed her and gave a subtle nod. Melissa understood immediately and walked away without interrupting. Ethan finished the last sip of his coffee and stood. "I should go. Lily gets out of school in less than an hour." Claire rose with him. "Thank you for staying. Thank you for finally telling me." They walked together toward the elevator. Before the doors opened, Claire spoke again. "Would you and Lily allow me to thank you properly with dinner sometime next week?" Ethan hesitated just long enough to think about his daughter. "If she can come too, I think she would enjoy that." Claire's smile reached her eyes. "I was hoping you would say that." The elevator doors closed, carrying Ethan toward the lobby while Claire remained standing in thoughtful silence. She had expected surprise, curiosity, perhaps even excitement. Instead, he had treated her exactly as he had in the coffee shop. As the elevator descended, Ethan glanced down at the visitor badge, still clipped to his jacket. He smiled to himself, unaware that upstairs, the board meeting had just begun with an unexpected announcement that would soon place his name before every executive in the company. The boardroom doors closed with a quiet click as Claire took her seat at the head of the long walnut table. Floor-to-ceiling windows filled the room with morning light, but nobody reached for the presentation screens. Every executive waited for her first words. Claire folded her hands and looked around the room. "Before we begin today's agenda, I want to discuss something more important than quarterly numbers." Curious glances passed from one executive to another. Claire pressed a button on the remote beside her. A security video from the neighborhood coffee shop appeared on the large display. The room watched in silence as a sharply dressed customer raised his voice toward a woman standing alone with a paper cup. Then another figure entered the frame. Ethan. Calm. Unhurried. Respectful. Nobody in the room spoke while the short recording played to its end. Claire switched off the screen. Not one person in that coffee shop knew who I was, she said quietly. One man chose to do the right thing anyway. A senior vice president leaned forward. Is that the technician who was here this morning? Claire nodded. Yes. Another executive glanced at the frozen image still visible on his laptop. He had no idea you owned this company. Exactly, Claire answered. That is why his actions mattered. The room remained thoughtful. They were accustomed to discussing investments, acquisitions, and expansion plans. This conversation felt entirely different. Claire continued. Character is easiest to recognize when there is nothing to gain. Several people slowly nodded. Melissa watched the room carefully, noticing how the atmosphere had shifted from curiosity to reflection. At the same time, Ethan pulled into the parking lot of Lily's school just as children poured through the front entrance. Lily spotted his truck immediately and waved with both hands before running over. She climbed inside with her backpack and smiled. Guess what happened today? Ethan laughed. Something tells me I am about to find out. Lily carefully placed a folded piece of paper on the dashboard. It was a certificate recognizing her for helping a new student feel welcome during recess. Ethan read every word before looking back at her. I am proud of you. Lily shrugged shyly. She looked lonely. Ethan smiled. Then you already know something many adults forget. She tilted her head. What? Kindness does not become valuable because someone notices it. Lily looked out the passenger window, quietly thinking about his words. That evening, after dinner, Ethan helped her finish a science project at the kitchen table while soft music played from an old speaker in the living room. Their modest home felt warm, peaceful, and full of small routines that mattered more than expensive things ever could. Across town, Claire sat alone in her office long after most employees had gone home. The city lights reflected across the glass as she opened a leather notebook containing handwritten thoughts she rarely shared with anyone. She wrote a single sentence. Integrity cannot be purchased. It can only be discovered. She closed the notebook and looked toward a framed photograph of her late father, the man who had built the company from a single roadside motel decades earlier. He had once told her that the greatest business decisions were always about people before profits. For the first time in years, those words felt completely alive again. Her phone buzzed softly. Melissa had sent tomorrow's schedule, including one personal dinner reservation for 3 people. Claire smiled before confirming it. Miles away, Ethan received a text message with the restaurant address and a simple note. Looking forward to meeting Lily. He showed the message to his daughter. Lily grinned. She already remembered my name. Ethan nodded, but something about the invitation stayed with him. He had expected a quiet dinner. Instead, he had the unmistakable feeling that tomorrow night would answer questions he had not even thought to ask. The restaurant overlooked a quiet lake just outside the city, where strings of warm lights reflected across the water and families lingered over unhurried conversations. Ethan parked his truck beside a row of luxury cars and glanced at Lily. She had spent nearly 10 minutes deciding which blue dress she wanted to wear. You look ready for a 5-star review, he said with a smile. Lily laughed. You only say that because I let you pick the shoes. Inside, Claire was already waiting near a window table. She stood as they approached, greeting Lily first. I am very happy to finally meet you. Lily smiled politely. Dad says you like coffee. Claire laughed. That is true, but I am hoping I like dinner with both of you even more. The conversation flowed naturally from the moment they sat down. There were no awkward pauses and no talk about business unless Ethan asked a question. Claire wanted to know what books Lily enjoyed, what science projects she had finished, and whether Ethan still found time to work on old cars during the weekends. Ethan admitted with a grin that his unfinished 1968 pickup project had been sitting in his garage for almost 2 years. Life keeps getting in the way, he said. Claire tilted her head. Or maybe life has been giving you something more important to build. Ethan looked at Lily, who was carefully coloring the paper placemat with restaurant crayons, and nodded quietly. That is probably true. As dessert arrived, a familiar voice interrupted the peaceful evening. Well, this is unexpected. Ethan turned and immediately recognized the man from the coffee shop. He wore another expensive suit and carried himself with the same confidence. but this time the confidence faded the instant he saw Claire. His expression shifted from surprise to visible discomfort. "Ms. Whitmore," he said carefully. Claire remained calm. "Good evening, Richard." Lily sensed the sudden tension and quietly looked toward her father. Ethan placed one reassuring hand on the table. Richard forced an uneasy smile. "I did not realize you knew each other." Claire met his eyes without raising her voice. "We met before either of us knew how important that meeting would become." Richard hesitated. "About the coffee shop." Claire gently interrupted him. "I reviewed the security footage before I reviewed your apology." Silence settled over the table. Richard lowered his eyes for the first time. "I made a mistake." Claire nodded once. "Yes, you did." She did not embarrass him. She did not lecture him. Her calmness carried more weight than anger ever could. "Our company represents people from every background," she continued. "Respect is not optional. It is part of the job." Richard quietly accepted her words. "I understand." He looked briefly toward Ethan. "You did the right thing that day." Ethan simply replied, "I hope we all do next time." Richard thanked them quietly before walking away. Lily watched him disappear into another dining room. "Dad," she whispered. Why did she forgive him? Ethan looked at Claire before answering. Claire spoke first. "Forgiveness does not erase what happened. It gives people the chance to become better than who they were." Lily slowly nodded, holding those words close. The rest of dinner felt lighter, but something had changed. Ethan noticed that Claire smiled more easily now, as though a burden she had carried alone had finally become lighter. When the meal ended, they walked together toward the parking lot beneath a sky filled with stars. Claire thanked Lily for making the evening so enjoyable. Lily hugged her without hesitation before climbing into the truck. Claire seemed surprised by the simple gesture, and for a brief second her eyes glistened in the soft light. Ethan noticed, but chose not to mention it. As he started the engine, Claire stepped closer to the driver's window. "There is something I would like to ask you tomorrow," she said gently. "It is important." Ethan searched her face, sensing that this was about far more than dinner. "Then I will be there." Claire watched the truck disappear down the road, knowing that the question she planned to ask could change not only Ethan's future, but the future of her company as well. The next morning, Ethan arrived at Whitmore headquarters carrying nothing more than his usual toolbox and a clean work jacket. He still assumed Claire wanted advice about an aging heating system or perhaps another conversation over coffee. Instead, Melissa greeted him in the lobby with a warm smile. "Good morning, Ethan. Ms. Whitmore is waiting for you upstairs." The elevator doors opened onto the executive floor, but this time there was no rush of meetings and no crowded hallway. Claire stood beside the window overlooking the city with 2 cups of coffee waiting on a small table. "Thank you for coming," she said. "You sounded serious," Ethan replied. Claire nodded. "I was." They sat across from each other in comfortable silence for a moment before Claire finally spoke. "This company serves millions of guests every year. We invest in buildings, technology, and marketing, but I have realized something important over the past week." Ethan listened without interrupting. "Character shapes a company more than any business plan ever will," she continued. "I have spent years searching for leaders who understand that." Ethan smiled slightly. "I am guessing that is difficult." Claire looked directly into his eyes. "Harder than I expected." She slid a folder across the table. Ethan opened it and found a proposal describing a new community outreach initiative that would connect Whitmore hospitality with local schools, shelters, and nonprofit organizations across the state. He looked up in surprise. "Why are you showing me this?" Claire folded her hands calmly. "Because I want you to help build it." Ethan blinked. "I repair heating and cooling systems." "You also build trust wherever you go," Claire answered. "Every person I asked described you the same way. Honest, dependable, respectful. They remembered how you made them feel long after the work was finished." Ethan lowered his eyes to the proposal again. "I have never managed something like this." Claire smiled gently. "Skills can be taught. Integrity cannot." Ethan remained quiet, carefully reading each page. The salary was far beyond anything he had imagined earning. The position included flexible hours, allowing him to remain present for Lily. Yet he hesitated. Claire noticed immediately. "Tell me what you were thinking." Ethan closed the folder. "I do not want people believing I received this because I happened to meet the chief executive officer." Claire expected that answer. "Neither do I." She reached for another document. It contained letters from the community center, the bakery, former customers, neighbors, teachers, and local business owners. None of them knew each other. Every letter described the same man. Ethan read them slowly, his expression softening with each page. These recommendations came from people whose lives you touched before you ever knew my name, Claire said quietly. This opportunity belongs to the man they described, not to the man who met me in a coffee shop. Ethan looked out the window, taking a slow breath. For the first time since losing his wife, he allowed himself to imagine a future that was not simply about surviving 1 month at a time. If I accept, he said carefully, I want the program to focus on families that usually get overlooked. Claire smiled without hesitation. That was exactly what I hoped you would say. Before either of them could speak again, Melissa stepped into the room with an apologetic expression. Ms. Whitmore, there is an urgent call from the board. Claire excused herself for a moment and answered. As she listened, the warmth slowly faded from her face. She thanked the caller and ended the conversation. Ethan immediately sensed something had changed. Claire looked back at him with quiet concern. It seems not everyone believes this program should move forward, she said. Some members of the board have decided they want to challenge the entire proposal before the vote this afternoon. Claire walked into the boardroom with calm confidence, while Ethan remained outside beside the tall windows overlooking the city. He had offered to leave, believing the discussion belonged to the company's leadership, but Claire had quietly asked him to stay nearby. Whatever happens in there, she had said, I want you to know this decision will never change why I chose you. Inside the room, the atmosphere was respectful but divided. One board member folded his hands across the table. Claire, your proposal is generous, but shareholders expect measurable returns. Why should we place a technician in charge of a statewide initiative? Claire stood without opening a single presentation slide. Because every report we study measures numbers, she answered. Very few measure trust. Another member leaned forward. Trust does not appear on a balance sheet. Claire smiled gently. It appears everywhere else. It appears when employees stay because they feel respected. It appears when communities welcome our company instead of tolerating it. It appears when guests choose us because they believe in what we represent. She paused before placing several handwritten letters on the conference table. These were written by teachers, volunteers, customers, neighbors, and local business owners. None of them knew I was asking questions about Ethan Brooks. None of them expected anything in return. Yet every one of them described the same man. The room grew quiet as the letters circulated from one person to another. One executive finally looked up. This cannot be rehearsed. Claire nodded. Exactly. Character never is. Minutes later, the chairman requested a formal vote. One by one, hands were raised around the table. Ethan watched through the glass as expressions gradually softened. He could not hear the conversation, only see Claire listening with steady composure. Finally, the chairman stood, smiled, and extended his hand. Claire shook it warmly. Melissa stepped into the hallway moments later with unmistakable excitement. Congratulations, she said. The proposal passed unanimously. Ethan exhaled slowly, almost laughing in disbelief. Claire joined him outside the boardroom, carrying the folder he had read earlier that morning. If the offer still stands, Ethan said quietly, I would be honored to accept. Claire handed him the folder. Welcome to Whitmore Community Partners. Several months passed, and the program quickly connected local schools, family shelters, food banks, and youth centers with resources they had struggled to find for years. Ethan spent less time chasing emergency service calls and more time building opportunities for families who needed someone to believe in them. Every afternoon, he still picked Lily up from school himself. Some routines were too important to surrender. One autumn evening, Claire joined them at the same neighborhood coffee shop where everything had begun. They chose a small table near the window. The barista recognized them this time with a warm smile instead of uncertainty. Lily stirred whipped cream into her hot chocolate before looking at Claire. Can I ask you something? Claire smiled. Of course. Lily tilted her head thoughtfully. If Dad had known who you really were that day, do you think he still would have helped you? Claire looked across the table at Ethan. He answered before she could speak. I would have done exactly the same thing. Claire held his gaze for a quiet moment, and the gentle smile that followed carried more gratitude than words ever could. Outside, people hurried past the windows, each carrying their own worries, never realizing that one ordinary act of respect inside a coffee shop had changed countless lives. Ethan reached for his coffee. Claire looked toward the evening sky, and Lily laughed at something neither adult had noticed. In that simple moment, there were no titles, no fortunes, and no strangers left between them. There was only a family built on trust, quiet courage, and choices made when nobody expected a reward. Sometimes the greatest miracle is not discovering that someone is extraordinary. It is discovering that ordinary kindness can quietly change the future for everyone it touches.